Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the podcast. And this time we're going to be on what's probably one of my favorite topics, which is getting great sounding records, but more specifically, avoiding doing the things that stop you from getting great sounding records. And more specifically, avoiding the lies that we tell ourselves that stop us from getting great sounding records. Because I've got to say, in my experience, both from when I was new at this and then getting better at it and seeing other people who were new at this and starting to get better at it, one of the things that comes up again and again that keeps us from doing our best work and really putting out the best sounding records we can is lying to ourselves. There are comforting lies we tell ourselves. They are so comfy, it is hard to cast them off. And one of them is something that I called the myth of 1,000 little choices in an article I did in SonicScoop back in 2014. And to this day, it's probably one of the most popular articles I've written on the site. It gets shared again and again with some regularity, has got a bunch of likes on it. And I really feel like it's time to do a podcast episode on this general subject. I'm not going to just rehash that article. You can check it out if you want. It's called The Myth of 1,000 Little Choices, the 80-20 Rule as Applied to Audio Engineering. And I want to tell you a few stories that didn't make it into that article that kind of inspired it and inspired my thinking on this topic. Now, a lot of you have probably heard about the 80-20 rule, or it's sometimes called the Pareto principle, that 80% of our results often come from 20% of the work. So if you have a company where there's like a sales team, something like 80% of the sales often come from the top 20% of salespeople in that company. And honestly, something like the 80% of the complaints come from the 20% of most annoying customers. And you also get something like 80% of your profit from the 20% of customers that are the best customers for you. Ideally, those past two groups aren't the same group. But this can be found in so many aspects of life. The guy Pareto, who it's named after, had observed that something like 20% of the pea pods that he was studying in plants contained 80% of the peas. And you see this kind of thing crop up a lot. Something like 80% of a nation's healthcare costs often come from about 20% of the patients. Something like 80% of the computer crashes come from 20% of the bugs that are out there. And this is something, fortunately, that's been popularized more and more and is starting to overcome this prior myth of 1,000 choices that I like to talk about that was so prevalent when I was coming up and that each one of us accidentally slips into now and then. And this myth of 1,000 little choices goes a little something like this. I read it in an article one time, and it just stuck in my craw, and I didn't know why, and it inspired me to write this article. But I read in an article once something along the lines of an audio engineer or music producer saying, each of the choices that we make when we're making a record, when we're putting together music, when we're putting art together, each of those choices may be really small and may have a really small impact. You may barely hear it. Choosing this preamp instead of that preamp, each one of them is so tiny. But when you stack them on top of each other, they all add up to a cumulative result that is bigger than the sum of its parts. And this sounds really pleasing, in part because there's a grain of truth in it. Everything I said there, I could do an article length, thing that would argue that case, and there's a grain of truth you could base that on. But I think we often go way too far with it. And in reality, most of the choices that you're making when you're mixing a record or mastering a record or moving a mic, you could have made a completely different choice and the record still would have turned out fine. Or if the record turned out awful, it still would have turned out awful if you had made a completely different choice. And this is coming from a guy, a mastering engineer, who will do quarter dB changes of EQ when I'm mastering a record. I am no stranger to that at all. But I'll tell you what, in most circumstances, if I had made a quarter dB change at a different frequency point, or even in a different direction, that's not the thing that's going to make or break the record. I'll tell you the things that will make or break the record. I'll tell you the things that do make or break the record. And I'll go a little bit into more detail on this for those of you guys who are skeptical of me coming out and bashing this myth of 1,000 little choices being really important and in favor of this 80-20 approach to engineering. At no point am I going to say you shouldn't be concerned about your craft and your details. But I am going to try to hammer into your mind, you've got to keep the right perspective or you're going to make sucky sounding records and you're going to make sucky art and you're not going to live up to your potential if you lie to yourself about the relative importance of different things. And I want to put a few specific examples out there to give you guys a sense for how things can go really, really badly and how they can go really, really well and how you can apply this kind of thinking to your work. Before I do it, man, that was a long intro because I'm on a bit of a rant mode today because you can tell I'm passionate about this one. I have to give a big shout out to our sponsor. So here is your 90 seconds or so of pure bliss, where I shout out this week's sponsors, and they are Soundtoys, a company I'm really passionate about. You will see that they have been a sponsor of this podcast from the beginning because they've been one of my favorite plugin companies for a really long time. Even when they have plugins coming out today that aren't suitable for me mastering, I still try them out because I love them, and I remember how much I love them, particularly in my mixing days. That said, there are some masters these days where I do sneak in a little bit of Soundtoys here and there. I won't tell you on which ones. So big shout out to those guys. Go check them out, soundtoys.com. Also, check out Gear Club, the Gear Club podcast. Check them out, gear-club.net. That is gear-club.net. The producers over there, Stu Lerman and John Agnello, fantastic guys making fantastic sounding records. Probably the other best podcast in the world as far as audio goes. You know, obviously, SonicScoop podcast is the best one. But after us, Gear Club, my goodness. No. Those guys probably have a better podcast. Check them out, gear-club.net. That is gear-club.net. If you want to hear some real wisdom and advice on music production and audio, just type Gear Club into the Google machine or wherever you get your podcasts. Last, certainly not least, sponsoring this podcast is us and potentially you. If you are getting your time's worth out of this podcast every time you listen to it and you keep on coming back for more, I would encourage you to become a supporter. Check us out at sonicscoop.com/Patreon or patreon.com/SonicScoop. And there you can become a supporter. It's not just out of the kindness of your heart and wanting to see this podcast continuing to exist. It's also to get great perks for you, like behind the scenes and even live Q&A episodes with me and some of our great guests, huge discounts on some of our courses. You can even get my book for free. I'll even give you a personal shout out. Yes, your name right here coming out of my mouth. You will be in the credits of this podcast each and every week. And if you're looking to improve your skills on mixing, definitely check out Mixing Breakthroughs or Mixing Drums or Mastering Demystified, my course where I tell you everything that I know about mastering. All right, and now back onto this week's topic. I want to tell you guys a couple of stories and tell me if they resonate with you. These are some of the things that made me really change my mind on this topic. Because I got to tell you, early on in my audio engineering career, I did make I don't want to say mistake, but I did have the habit, potentially not a very good habit, of spending a little too much time on audio forums, reading them, sometimes even participating in them. And I don't even know if they were always the best influence. Some forums that gave you the sense that gear was the be-all, end-all, and that you should be obsessing about the tiny variations in color between different devices. Now, don't get me wrong. Part of the fun of being an audio engineer or a music producer is obsessing about the differences in pieces of gear. And, this paintbrush gives me a little bit of a wider stroke, and this one gives me a little bit of a thinner stroke. Those are the things we're often looking for in our gear. But we can take this thinking way too far to a place where it's going to hold us back and make us do less good work. And I'm going to tell you a few stories about that. I actually remember one time renting out at a very cheap price to one of my clients at that point some recording gear I had around. He was going to do an important recording session to him out of his kind of small studio that he had just started, and he wanted to borrow some Neve preamps from me and a couple of nice mics. So I sent him with a bunch of stuff and gave him a great deal on renting some stuff that at that point I still owned because I was doing a lot of recording back then. And when he came back to me a week later, he was looking a little disappointed when he handed me these Neve pre's, or they're Neve emulation pre's, really good ones. And he's like, I was just expecting them to do more. I was expecting them to make a bigger impact. And I kind of shrugged because at that point I've been doing it for a long time. And I said, yeah, preamps are not that big of a deal. Grr. This is heresy coming out of the mouth of an audio engineer. You're supposed to obsess about preamps. And to a degree, we do. And to a degree, you have a whole bunch of different brands preamps in the studio. You like this preamp a little more for snare drum, this preamp a little more for drum overheads. I mean, I have my favorites, absolutely. There are preamps I'd prefer to put on drum overheads over other ones. But at the end of the day, if someone made me switch all of my preamp choices, I could still make a good sounding record. That is not what's making the record good or bad. That is just kind of preference. And the little bit of extra brightness or slowness or girth you're getting out of one preamp or another can easily be compensated for with a touch of EQ, a touch of saturation, a touch of moving the mic, a touch of playing the instrument slightly differently. I mean, there are so many things that make such a bigger impact than having the right preamps. But there are a lot of people telling themselves these stories that get in the way of them doing really great work, get in the way of them finishing and saying, this is good enough, we're going to put it out there, and then we're going to do something else, and we're going to do something else, and we're going to do something else. And there's this kind of this fear and this desire to have everything be perfect that stands in the way of people and actually getting stuff done and getting the practice they need to get in to make truly great sounding records, because that's where it comes from. Also, this same kind of obsession over the smaller, sexier details over the bigger, less sexy, and more important big picture choices can get in the way when people do finish and make them have worse results than they should. I'll tell you another story. I don't know if this one's going to resonate with you or not. Maybe you've experienced something like it. And I remember when I was still mixing a lot, I was asked to mix a record for a client of mine. They didn't have a huge budget. I'd help them record some stuff, and they didn't have a huge budget left for mixing. So I gave them a quote, and I gave them a really inexpensive quote. I'd worked on the stuff. I liked the band. It was cheaper than I'd normally do it for. And they said, I don't know. I don't know if we want to spend that much mixing the record. I think we'll have our friend do it, and he's going to do it, practically for free. And I said, fine, do what you have to do. Absolutely can be a great learning experience for that person to spend a lot of time on it and hopefully get better at the craft as they go along by doing it. Bless you, and I hope you have great results. But later I found out that they ended up having this record mastered by one of the best and most expensive mastering engineers in the world. Like, not just in our town. My town at that time was New York City. So one of the best mastering engineers there, I'd say the best mastering engineer there, is not only the best mastering engineer in the city, but potentially the world. They had it mastered by him. Maybe he gave them a friendly discount indie rate or something that'd be less than he would charge to, some huge major label, multi-platinum artist. So maybe they got a friendly rate. But still, one of the most expensive mastering engineers in the world, one of the best. They had him master a record that was mixed by, basically a friend of the band for close to free. And that mastering engineer did a good job mastering it in the sense that the bass to high relationship was as good as it could be. The thing sounded wider than it did before, appropriate volume. But all of the issues in the mix were still the issues in the mix. And when it came to the guitar solo, I think it was even like the first song, the hi-hat was literally louder than the guitar solo. Man, that is not a little tweak. That is not one of these tiny 1,000 little choices that we obsess over. No. If your hi-hat is louder than your guitar in the guitar solo, then that's a problem. And maybe you ended up leaving it that way because you were too obsessed, too microscoped in and zoomed in on these tiny little choices you thought you should be obsessing about. Like, what preamp am I using? What saturator am I using? Should I be cutting this EQ by 1.5 dB or 1.6 dB? Should I be making this cut at 420 hertz or 430 hertz? Should I be putting this 1 dB EQ boost at 8K or 9K? Compared to, is your hi-hat louder than your guitar solo? All of those choices are effectively meaningless. And relative to having your hi-hat louder than your guitar solo or not, any single one of those choices, you could have reversed them, and it would have just been a matter of taste. It wouldn't have been a matter of, is this record good or bad? And this is not to discount the contribution of mastering engineers. I'm a mastering engineer. That's all the audio work I do these days is mastering. When people ask me to record or mix, I refer them to some of my mastering clients because I just master. So I'm telling you that getting the mastering right is not as important as getting the mixing right. Getting the mixing right is not as important as getting the recording right. Getting the recording right is not as important as getting the performance and the songwriting and having something to say right. You know that. You already know that deep down, but how often do you lie to yourself and not act in accordance with what you know to be true? If you're anything like me, you do it way too often. But the less we do it, I think the more successful we'll be. Like I said, don't get me wrong, mastering can make a big difference. If you have a record that you did, you're not thrilled with the results, you've taken as far as you can in the mix, and you just know that it's not all the way there. Sometimes you can bring one of those to a really good mastering engineer who's really on your side and understands what you want on the project. And you can be surprised by how well that record turns out after you're done. I mean, I've had clients write back to me in shock after hearing their masters, with like, I had no idea my record could sound like this. And that is because on those occasions, I'm digging in and I'm really doing the best I can to get that record closer to where they really intended it to be. And on some of those records, I might be making really, significant changes. There are other records where I make really minimal changes. But the big thing here is not which frequency I boost or cut, and it's not whether I boost or cut it by a quarter of a dB. Like I say, I make quarter of a dB boosts and cuts. They're almost to a degree for my own vanity and for my own tastes. It's not to say that they're totally inconsequential and can't be heard, but any of my little quarter dB booster cuts that I might make while mastering, I probably could have put them in a different place or taken them out entirely, and the record would probably sound ultimately just as good, more or less. You know what? I'll go one step further. Just as good. The big things that are important for me to get right in mastering are knowing whether this record should be darker or brighter than it is now, knowing whether the bass and kick are sitting together properly, or if one of them is way too low compared to the other because of the idiosyncrasies of the person's room and speakers that they were listening on. Do I need to rebalance the low frequencies, or is there too much sub compared to upper bass, or too much upper bass compared to sub? Those are the things that I am needing to get right. Is this the kind of record where I want to have a really light touch, or is it the kind of record where I should be heavy-handed? Is this record darker than the artist wants it to be, or brighter than the artist that wants it to be, or am I taking it in the wrong direction? Those are some of the big wins. Now, I told you that I wouldn't just simply read aloud from this article and call that a podcast, and I won't, but I am just going to read a couple of passages that probably say this more eloquently than I can in passionate rant mode right now. So here are a couple of things that I just want to excerpt out from this article. So in the article version, the myth of 1,000 little choices, the 80-20 rule as applied to audio engineering. I do admit that at first, this idea can be discomforting. A belief in the crucial importance of each of our 1,000 little choices serves as a welcome and ego-enriching crutch. To think that you might have settled on the exact opposite choice for every single one of your smallest tweaks and would have made no significant difference in how great or terrible your mix turned out. So many of the choices you spent the most time obsessing over may have made little or no appreciable difference at all to the end listener. But who wants to think that way? As far as appearances are concerned, fussing about with differences that are barely audible to others, if they are in fact audible at all, can make us look like these rare, inscrutable, mad scientists of sound, hyper devoted to the project and in touch with something in the ether that mere mortals cannot grasp. This kind of thing is a plus when your competition includes, at least in theory, anyone with access to a reasonably powerful laptop or tablet. But once you've accepted the power of this 80-20 way of thinking, it can be much more empowering than it is disquieting. It means that 20% of our action and activity gives us 80% of our results. It means that as long as we can identify and do well with those choices and tasks that matter most, then we have tremendous leeway to be expressive and to enjoy the process. We have tremendous power to become faster and more effective. And we have tremendous room to make art. And I think that is one of the big takeaways here, that by simply reframing the way you're thinking about this, and rather than being so zoomed in to your details and saying, these details really matter, and if I don't get this half dB of boost or cut right, the record will be lost. If instead of thinking that way, you can maintain the appropriate perspective and say, hey, there's a few big things I really got to make sure are right. And you know what? If we get those things right, then this record will turn out pretty good as it can be. And we have all of this room to make mistakes or play around or try things that may or may not be the best choices. And that's okay. We have room to fail, room to experiment, room to go out on a limb without upsetting the balance and overall impact of this final thing. But there are a few really important things that I've got to be focused on, understand what they are, and kind of keep them near the front of my mind at all times. And I'll go over what a few of those might be. This article goes into them in a little bit more depth. So I write in the article here that the underlying reality is that great work comes not from the 1,000 little choices we make, but from the few big principles that inform them all. If you can get those key principles right, 80% of the job will fall into place without much thought or effort at all. Focus on improving those 20% of choices and habits that have an outsized impact, and the rest of your choices will almost like rise up to meet the standard that you've set for yourself. So after establishing this in the article version, I do share what some of the biggest and most important choices are. Some of the most important things that you can focus your 20% of your time and mental energy on to get 80% of your results that really matter. But because I mentioned gear, I also want to throw out a few things on the gear front. If you're recording, preamps can be fun. If you are mixing different plugins or, hardware color boxes can be fun. And they can have legitimately different sounds from one another, even in blind listening tests. Some of them, not all of them. But what are the gear improvements, if you can obsess about that stuff, that makes the biggest differences? And I would say those purchases that you can make that make relatively big differences, well, microphones make a bigger impact on your final sound than do preamps, dramatically so. And it's amazing to me that there are people who've been doing this stuff for years and years and years who will kind of say the opposite. There was one guy, amazing producer engineer, brilliant guy, love him to pieces, will not say his name right now, really popular presenter at MixCon, by the way, which is coming up July 27th. He had a great video presentation there, but he said to me, some of these young people who are, sending me projects, they'll be working, in their apartment, and there'll be like this kind of tinny sound to some of their stuff. And, I'm always trying to tell them to get a better interface or a better preamp to help improve their sound. And I'm like, really? Really? They're recording with a cheap microphone, with a cheap instrument in their apartment, and the walls are just like drywall and plaster, and you think the preamp is the problem? You really think that's the weak link in this puzzle? So amazing to me that people who should know better sometimes get it twisted. Microphones make a bigger difference than do your preamps and interfaces. No questions about it. It's just harder to get physical membranes right. On the other side of things, your speakers are going to make a huge difference, and your room is going to make a huge difference when it comes to the sounds that you're getting. If you're not hearing things properly, you're going to make bad choices. And if you're recording instruments, if the room isn't treated at all, you're going to not really be totally satisfied with the sounds that you're getting. So those are two things. One of them can be a little sexy, fortunately, microphones. The other, monitoring and room treatment, unfortunately, isn't that sexy in people's minds. But come on, guys, look behind me. That's some sexy looking room treatment. You want to get some of this for yourselves. I mean, come on. That's handsome. That's a GIK diffuser back there. It's pretty. You want one of those. Room treatment. It can be sexy. Speakers, they can definitely be sexy. So come on. Focus on that kind of stuff when it comes to purchases. The other big things are unique tools that allow you to do things that you would literally otherwise be unable to do. Instead of having, a 40th flavor of compressor, that's better than your 39th flavor of, plug-in compressor, there may be some tools out there that allow you to do things that would literally be impossible if you didn't have that tool. And then last, and this is certainly not least, investing in your own training. Man, investing in your skills is the hugest thing. The best way to do that is to put a lot of time in doing actual work with actual other people, making great sounds. But I've got to say, online courses can be extremely helpful. Taking an in-person seminar or class with someone can be really, really helpful. Quick plug, check out Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, or Mixing Drums. That's mixingbreakthroughs.com, masteringdemystified.com, or mixingdrums.com. Some of SonicScoop's fine, fine courses, two of which feature yours truly. But those kinds of things really can make a big difference. This, not a sponsored plug here, Quiz Tones. It's an ear training app by our partners at the Pro Audiophiles. That can be a great thing to sharpen up your ears. One of our great SonicScoop contributors, Roger Montiano, he has his own ear training program for audio engineers and producers. You can find a Pro Audio Masterclasses. Again, not a paid plug, just something that exists out there. I mean, man, this kind of thing can make a huge difference compared to upgrading your preamps potentially and compared to, getting yet another flavor of compressor or EQ. So that's on the gear side. On the actual process side, here are some of the things that I point out in the article that seem to resonate with quite a few people. 1, take breaks and take notes. We often do our best mixing when we are not mixing. Man, that is a huge one for me. And I go into a little more detail on that in this article. But if you can step back, lie down on the couch with a notepad and not touch anything, your listening skills will improve immensely and you'll know what you need to do and you can go back and act on it. Start with the most important elements. Man, that is huge. That is so huge when it comes to mixing. Maybe the most important elements are drums and bass. And if you're starting there all the time, great. But not on every song is the most important element or the most important section going to be the first ones that you think of. You might not want to start your mix out on the quiet verse of the song. It might be a good idea to dive into a really dense section and really start working on your mix there. And it might be worthwhile in some songs not to start with bass and drums, but to start with a vocal or acoustic guitar or some kind of pad, whatever is really the most important element in that particular mix. I alluded to it earlier, get your monitoring right. And here's a big thing, always use references. And when it comes to references, I don't necessarily mean I'm going to compare my track to this other track and try to make it sound just like it. No, I mean informing your ear for what's an appropriate amount of bass, what's an appropriate amount of high end. Let me get retuned to my room and my speakers. What does good music sound like in this room? And how far can I push things? What does a too loud vocal sound like? Let me listen to some records. Oh, actually, I can make my vocal louder. Maybe I shouldn't be so nervous about making it louder. Maybe I can make my snare drum louder. I don't have to worry about that. Oh, maybe my hi-hat is loud compared to every single hi-hat, other hi-hat in the universe. Like these are things that you can listen to. And it doesn't have to be during your mix or during your recording. You can do it in the beginning just to, set the tone for the day, or you can do it when you're taking a break. But using references and trusting your monitoring is very important. And I think listening to other music in your monitoring situation, we call referencing, is hugely important. Work fast. Man, this is big. Don't let yourself get too bogged down on any one choice. And I think that is one of the biggest takeaways from this. There are too many people who spend too much time obsessing about that little EQ wiggle while they're forgetting to turn up their guitar solo and turn down their hi-hat. This is a fifth one. Compare a limited set of options and then decide quickly. Man, I'm glad that I'm rereading this article myself as I go along because some of these things, man, I've got to hammer them back into my brain all the time. Even if most choices really don't matter much, you can try to give yourself a few choices that matter more than others. When EQing, listen for what too much and too little energy at a given frequency might sound like before trying to settle on the spot that works best. So the big thing here is when you're EQing, go a little too far in one direction and a little too far in the other direction, and then find a balance that works. Give yourself a meaningful basis of comparison. When you're working on balances, do the same kind of thing. Move the fader too low and then too high. You will quickly intuit for yourself where the happy medium is with a minimum of fussing over quarter dB increments. That's a huge trick I keep on coming back to. I always say that tuning a mix is like tuning a guitar. You turn the fader up and down, you go a little too high, a little too low, and you get honed in into the right spot for that fader to be. You're not going to just go there and get it. And once you go to a place that you've guessed at, trying a little higher, a little higher, a little higher, a little lower, a little lower, I think that works a little less well than setting a parameter for yourself. Establish Oh man, if I go here, that's too loud. So we know it's got to be quieter than that, and bring it down, bring it down, bring it down, and then find a spot that works. And then bring it till it's too low and say, oh, that's definitely too low. And then bring it up and bring it up and bring it up and find that spot in the middle, honing in to the right spot. An EQ on a fader. This is something that you can end up doing very rapidly and without even thinking about it. But I think that that is a good process or technique, or at least principle, to inform you that you want to give yourself a limited range of options to choose from, and then from that limited range of options, choose the one that seems to be clearly best. You'll make your decisions a lot faster. Here's one of my favorites: decide on what's important and make bold moves. You can read this in more detail on the article itself. But something that comes up again and again and again when I talk to great mixers on this podcast and in other interviews I've done is that every section of a song should have a focal point. You can't have everything be the most important thing. You've got to decide on what elements are really the most important and then be bold about them and let them be the most important. That doesn't mean you shortchange all of your other elements. It doesn't mean you get sloppy with all of your other elements, but it means that you boldly make decisions about what's really important. And you be unafraid to push the listener's ear in that direction. You can do this in writing. You can do this in recording. You can do this in mixing. You can take that principle with you pretty much anywhere you go in audio. Listening in context is a big one. A lot of people making mistakes, like having a guitar solo quieter than your hi-hat, or probably people who are listening in solo too much. And you can end up listening for way too long in solo, making all these little tweaks, and then you turn back on the full mix and you found that all these tweaks that seemed so important and meaningful in solo weren't that important and meaningful in the context of the whole thing. And a lot of people, especially early on, will go into solo because they say, I can't hear the differences, that clearly when I'm listening in the context of the whole thing. And to that I say, duh, yeah, that's because those differences don't make a big difference. If you are making changes that you can't hear in the context of everything playing, it's not a big, important difference that you're working on. You're spending a ton of time working on things that don't matter. But if you're listening in context, you might be unafraid to push your EQ a little further than some of the old fogey magazines tell you should push an EQ. Or you might mess around with a fader until you get something really in the right spot, instead of thinking you have an EQ problem and working on an EQ in solo for a while, when what you really need to do was hone into the right fader balance and spend some time doing that in context with all of your other stuff. And then the last piece of advice I gave in this original article was that it's not the gear. You've probably heard the phrase that it's a poor craftsman who blames his tools, and it's a poor audio engineer who thinks he needs better ones. Once all of your basic requirements are met, any additional equipment is a luxury, not a necessity. It's not worth fretting over luxuries. They are to be enjoyed. They are not to be worried over. And I think that's something I've got to repeat because it's one of the biggest takeaways, one of the biggest changes in thinking that I had that allowed me to do better work. Once your basic requirements and gear are met, any additional equipment is a luxury. Luxuries are not bad things. They're not necessities. It's not worth fretting over luxuries. You don't worry about them. You don't get your panties in a bunch because you don't have the luxury that you want. You get the job done and you do good work. But when you do have luxuries, you enjoy them. Just don't worry about them. It's very freeing. Now, I do want to leave you. I said I wasn't going to read this article out loud, but apparently it's a really good article. I'm getting a little weepy reading this myself. I don't know who this guy is who wrote it, but it's wonderful. So I want to read you some of the closing thoughts from this one. And other people out there apparently liked it as well. This is something, again, where I just couldn't say it any better now if I tried. So I have to leave you with this parting quote from the article itself. If you get the essentials right, 80% of your project will fall into place. As for the other 20%, well, there's another saying. The perfect is the enemy of the good. If you can get even half of the remaining 20% right, that means you got 9 out of 10 right there, which is far better than most projects in the world end up. Most of your favorite records, if you're being honest with yourself, are probably a 9 out of 10 if you were to rate them right now Maybe there's like one record, maybe two in like the history of the universe you'd give a 10 out of 10. And even then, you'd probably give it a 9.8 out of 10 or something, right? So most of your favorite records are probably a 9 out of 10. And you probably, like me, have some favorite records or movies or books that you'd rate as an 8 out of 10. That's 4 stars out of 5. That's pretty good. Don't tell me you don't have any favorite records or favorite movies that if you were being, honest and critical, you should give them a 4 out of 5. But there's still some of your favorites. That's 80% right there. So perfection, ultimately, is not for this world. While the rest of them out there are driving themselves neurotic by shooting for perfect, focusing on the 80% of those meaningless choices that give them 20% of the results, while the rest of them are out there, rarely, if ever, finishing and delivering great results on the core, essential part of the project, you can already be onto your next project and onto the next one and onto the next one because you're just doing good work and focusing on those 20% of the choices that give you 80% of your results. And then once you've done that, you can spend all the time you want fiddling around with that last 20% and getting it, just in the right spot for your taste and the client's taste. And that's how great careers are made. They are not made by fussing over perfect, because perfect never comes. So when it comes to perfect versus done, done is always better. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this week's podcast. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Couple big notices for you. MixCon is coming July 27th, that weekend, July 27th, July 28th. Come to MixCon and get into the process of real working professionals who are making amazing records. We're going to have Tony Maserati there, keynote presenter. For those of you guys who are not familiar with the format of MixCon, we get major mixers who've done amazing work up on stage in front of hundreds of people, and they crack open one of their mixes for us to look under the hood at and really look in detail at exactly what they're doing inside their mix, what their philosophy is, what their approach is, and how the mix sounded before they started working on it, how it sounded when they were done, and really see exactly what they do and hear it change as it goes along. And then you can ask real questions in real time of these amazing professionals, and you can be around hundreds or thousands of your peers in the audio and music world. We get producers there. We get engineers there. We get recording musicians there. We get people of all stripes there. Working pros who have been in the field for a really long time. We get students and learners there. We get artists working on their record who want to learn more about the process. You've got to check it out. Come down to MixCon. It's going to be at New York City at the Manhattan Center the weekend of July 27th in New York City. I hope to see you guys there. More info coming this week and next on the exact roster of presenters. Please do yourself a favor and don't miss it. Big thanks to our sponsors for this week. Huge shout out to SoundToys once again. Thank you for sponsoring this podcast, making some of my favorite plugins in the known universe. Check them out at soundtoys.com. That is soundtoys.com. Try out anything they make for free, like the Decapitator, the Echo Boy, the Devil Lock Deluxe, the Crystallizer, the Primal Tap. So many cool plugins. Also, check out Gear Club if you want a different perspective on audio. Stu Lerman and John Agnello, two amazing producer engineers, really fun guys to listen to. I would say the other best podcast in the world of audio engineering, music production podcasts. You got to check them out. Gear Club, that's gear-club.net, or type Gear Club wherever you get your podcasts. Last but not least, this podcast is brought to you by supporters like you. Check us out at sonicscoop.com/Patreon or patreon.com/SonicScoop to become a supporter for yourself and join the community of supporters. And also to get great free perks like my book, Mixing Advice from Your Mastering Engineer, or huge discounts on some of our courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Mixing Drums. You can earn back the cost of your membership pretty much instantly with one of those discounts on one of our courses. All right. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.